Okay, welcome again. Let's take a look at another chapter here of America's Soul Destiny. Tonight, you know what we've dealt with in America's Soul Destiny, and the metaphor is baking American pie so we can share it with the world, and I kind of love that symbolism. And so we will be looking at tonight what I call America's spiritual stream. Watering the seeds. Remember how we've looked at the spiritual seeds that were brought over from Greece and Egypt, Greece, Rome, Europe, Palestine, came over here to America, and they were transplanted here by the founding farmers. And now we're going to be looking at the stream, the spiritual stream that's watering those seeds. So here you see that as well. We have two divergent and convergent paths of spirituality that are going on here in America. And underneath all of it and surrounding all of it is Native American spirituality. Now, we talked about Native American spirituality, but this is going to be really important to understand that this underpins everything that happens here in America. It's the highest consciousness there is. And some of it trickles into the metaphysical spiritual arena, and some of it trickles into the religious arena. But more and more we're waking up to the higher wisdom of the Native American spirituality. But we do have the America spiritual stream right there, which is we find in the metaphysical spiritual teachings in America. And then, of course, alongside of it, we have America's religious road. Sometimes these are two paths traveling side by side. Sometimes they are not. Sometimes they seem to be diabolically opposed, the opposite ends of the spectrum. And that's the way they sometimes look. But we've always got the Native American spirituality there surrounding the whole path. And then there are times when what we have is the spiritual stream underneath that of the religious road here. And what we get many times from the religious road, many people will come out that door and they will fall out of church. How many in here are recovering Catholics, recovering Protestant, recovering Baptist, recovering Church of Christ, recovering fundamentalists, or recovering fear, sin, guilt? That's pretty much what makes up this whole arena, is it not? It makes up the metaphysical spiritual teachings of those who have had enough of the fear and the guilt and the shame and say there's got to be a different way. Well, not only is this spiritual stream there to catch people coming out of normative religion, but it also bubbles back up and challenges them for new growth and for an expansion of belief systems. So let's take a look at the spiritual stream here. And one of the most important things is this quote by Woodrow Wilson. America has a spiritual energy in her which no other nation can contribute to the liberation of mankind. I love that quote. Let's just take a look at it, see how that plays out here. We're going to recap something that we went over and spent a class on, but we'll do this very quickly, about Native American spirituality, Indian spirituality. They see the earth as their mother, that the Great Spirit indwells and outdwells everything. It surrounds everything. It's very panentheistic. Panentheism means that God is in all things and God surrounds all things, that God is inclusive, permeates everything. That's a very high mystical teaching about panentheism. So that's very natural to the Native Americans. The Native American spirituality is also very vision-based and very wisdom-based. It's naturally mystical. It is also one, the culture demands total honesty. It demands from a standpoint of they have this great desire to always be able to commune with Creator or with the Great Spirit. In order to do that, they know that they must be completely honest because nature never lies. So it's been an imperative thing culturally for all the Native American cultures to be totally honest with everybody in their dealings, and they can't even conceive of it doing differently. So total honesty is huge in Native American spirituality, as well as balance, because they see that as the key to life. They see that everything is in a state of oneness, that we are all related. So And from that, they have no concept of duality. That's something they can't even conceive of. Now, when I talk about Native Americans, I'm talking about indigenous wisdom, indigenous spirituality. This is also the same spirituality that all the great mystics have come to find throughout the history of humanity. The Native Americans had no concept of hell or the devil, and they saw that all life was sacred. So everything was sacred to them. Everything was a reflection of God, of Creator. Oh, I didn't realize I didn't have these up there for you. And I'll move on here to the next one. Of the great quotes, here's one from Chief Seattle. And the basic thing here in the great Chief Seattle quote is that all things are connected. And that man and woman is just a strand in the web of life. And whatever we do to somebody else, we are actually doing to ourselves. And of course, I love the great Chief Joseph quote here. We do not want churches because they will teach us to quarrel about God, as the Catholics and Protestants do. We do not want to learn that. They've kind of stood outside of religion. And some of us who have had a deep religious background have also said, ooh, I think there's a higher and better way to live than just that. But summarizing the Native Americans, probably nothing does it better than the Native American or the Indian 10 Commandments. And we first look at them here. Treat the earth and all that dwell thereon with respect. I think these are the greatest 10 Commandments ever written. Remain close to the Great Spirit. Show great respect for your fellow human beings. Give assistance and kindness wherever needed. Do what you know to be right. Look after the well-being of mind and body. Then it goes on, dedicate a share of your efforts to the greatest good. Be truthful and honest at all times. And here's the great kicker. And this is one of the keys of spirituality, is take full responsibility for your actions. There is no vicarious anything. We are completely responsible for everything we do. Karma is due and payable always with us, and pretty instantly today where we are. So that's what's going to undergird the American psyche, the American religious and spiritual development is going to be this platform of Native American spirituality. But let's take a look at the emerging America's spiritual stream here. It goes all the way back to Plato, the Greek philosopher. Now, Plato and Socrates before him were totally concerned with the soul. And Plato realized that reality lies in the realm of divine ideas. In other words, it's not what we can physically see through our senses, but that reality is behind what we physically see with our senses. And Plato said that even humans can know this realm. And he also talked about the pre-existence of the soul. Now, what does that mean, pre-existence of the soul? Well, we think of it in terms of reincarnation. In other words, the idea that the soul has existed before this lifetime and that it comes in to do whatever lessons it needs in any given lifetime, and it's an ongoing process into that state of perfection, into that state of wholeness. Well, following Plato was Philo-Judaeus, and he comes out of the Jewish tradition, and he believed in a very metaphysical interpretation of the Bible, which became the foundation for the Kabbalah of mystical Judaism. Then we go and we look at the next great voice, and this one comes from within the Christian tradition. How many of y'all have ever heard of Father Origen here? Origen was fantastic. He came from Alexandria, but now he was the great voice until Augustine came on the scene in the early 5th century, late 4th century. But Father Origen taught also about the pre-existence of the souls. And by the way, if you did not know this, that reincarnation was openly taught in Christianity up until 553 of the Common Era, when at the Second Council of Constantinople it was expunged, because this was the origin influence in Christianity of teaching reincarnation. And matter of fact, there's still passages left in the Bible referring to it, and Jesus refers to it as well. But Father Origen taught that Jesus was a virtuous soul that was chosen because of his great soul maturity to come in and do this. Not something, a special dispensation of being the only Son of God, but a great soul in his evolution. And Origen taught that consciousness is developed and attained from lifetime to lifetime. This is the foundational part of Christianity that what we think of as second, third century Christianity. Origen also taught about that there was a universal salvation. Even the devil could be saved with the way Origen saw God and the way early Christianity was. That there really was no such, the heaven and hell and the resurrection and the second coming, all of those were metaphorical. They were symbolic. He taught about the goodness and the perfectibility of the human. A very different tack that comes in with Augustine. It comes up with this very sick concept of original sin. It doesn't make sense. Has it ever made sense to any of y'all yet about original sin? How a baby could be born tainted? It just doesn't make any sense unless you buy that. And if you buy that, then you got to go buy salvation from the same people that sold you that other bill of goods. So, anyway, Origen teaches the allegorical and mystical interpretation of the Bible. And then we go on to perhaps the purest mystic of all time, Meister Eckhart. How many of y'all have ever heard of Meister Eckhart? Meister Eckhart is the father of German philosophy, but he was the great medieval German monk who had a direct connection to God and basically tapping into, but probably defining it and stating it better than anybody had ever done so in Christianity. But Meister Eckhart said that anyone can know God because we are all one with God, and that we have the ability to have direct communion with God. He went on to say this: the eye with which I see God is the same as that with which He sees me. My eye and the eye of God are one. One vision, one knowledge, and one love. That's a mouthful, isn't it? That's a lot. And he did not get burned at the stake back in the time when they did all these type of things. And they crucified. Somehow or another, he escaped all of that. I don't know how he did it, but he did it because everybody else got burned for saying things a lot less controversial than this. But then he goes on to say this: the seed of God is in us. Given an intelligent and hard-working farmer, it will thrive and grow up to God, whose seed it is, and accordingly its fruits will be God nature. Pear seeds grow into pear trees, nut seeds grow into nut trees, and God seeds grow into God. Wow. Isn't that amazing? God seeds grow into God. Basically, Meister Eckhart said that every one of us, whether we realize it or not, is a God seed, a God growing up in potential. Let God be God in you was one of his favorite sayings in his services and sermons. Pay attention to what is within you, announce it and pronounce it, produce it, and give birth to it. Very much the same thing that Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. It's about bringing forth that which is within us. That is the purpose of our soul evolution. That is the purpose of a given lifetime, is to rise to the challenges and bring forth more of our own music, more of our own song. In this breaking through, I find that God and I are both the same. If the only prayer you ever say your entire life is thank you, it will be enough. Isn't that beautiful? That is so beautiful, being in that state of gratitude. That was Meister Eckhart. Now, we're going to move fast through this because we got a lot of ground to cover, but I just want you to get a feel for Meister Eckhart. If you want to find out more about him, Matthew Fox has written a book about Meister Eckhart, and nobody understands Eckhart better than Matthew Fox. And we'll be talking about Matthew Fox later on here. But the book is called Breakthrough. And Matthew Fox may be symbolically a later day incarnation of Meister Eckhart. He certainly carries the same energy within the church. Now let's take a look at America's religious road. And what happens here in America is we know that the first religious group to come over was from Europe, and it was the Puritans. Now, what do the Puritans believe in? Well, first of all, they came over in the 1600s, starting in 1620, and through the 1600s, they colonized the area from the Chesapeake to New England. But their primary doctrine was that in the belief of the depravity of man. Ooh, doesn't that just feel so wonderful? They believed in predestination. In this predestination, they were such optimists that they only believed only a very few, and nobody knew who they would be saved. And it would be up to God. And it was just like a crapshoot. Oh, well. And that God's will was revealed through the Scriptures. God's will is revealed through the Scriptures. Later on, we're going to talk about God's will and understanding it from spirituality. But they saw that God was distant from humanity, separate from creation. And H.L. Mencken probably had the best quote of understanding Puritanism. It's that haunting feeling that someone somewhere may be happy, and we cannot have that under any circumstance. Well, is there any question why there might be some anti-Puritanism come up? I mean, does that sound like the most loving and wonderful plan? There's got to be another option. Actually, there wasn't many options back then except for some very courageous people who said there's got to be another way. Roger Williams was one of them who broke away from that and established the colony, which became later the state of Rhode Island. And now here's a real interesting one here, is Anne Hutchinson comes on the scene. Anne Hutchinson's a devout Boston Puritan. And she is just wanting to study her minister's teachings, so she decides to create a little study group at home. That had never been done before. That raised great questions. Matter of fact, they thought it was a heresy, and she became persecuted for it. And all she's trying to do is just develop a deeper faith by studying these teachings at home, but you can't do that outside the church. And so not only was she persecuted and her followers, but many of her followers were hanged for it, and then later she was hanged for it. Boy, she just came a little too early for this. But then after that, we know William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, was part of the anti-Puritanism movement here. There had to be another way than following this idea of predestination and the depravity of the human being. Well, the Quakers come on the scene. The Quakers are founded by George Fox. But then William Penn creates this colony in Pennsylvania based on Quaker beliefs. And what the Quakers believed is that you could have direct communication through what was known as the inner light. That was deeply heretical, to talk about the inner light. Now, the Quakers did not have any hierarchy, nor did they have any ministry. It was very egalitarian. It was one of shared service. Matter of fact, people used to go to the Quaker meetings, and they still do if you go to one. And if you're not used to it, if you come from a Protestant tradition, that's one where you have this really abstract God, they sit in silence, and then somebody says, well, when does the service begin? And they say, the minute you walk out of here. Think about that. When does the service begin? The minute that you walk out of here. It's about being of service to humanity. They were deeply pacifistic, and they believed in religious tolerance across the board. They were the reformers, and they were anti-slavery. My favorite saying coming from the Quaker tradition is this: pray and move your feet. Pray and move your feet. In other words, your prayers mean nothing unless you put action behind them, unless you live it, unless you breathe it. That it's all about praying and move your feet. Nothing could be a greater statement for us today in transforming America and transforming the world and bringing about a wisdom culture, which we will in time here on the earth. But let's look at what happened here. We had this progressive idea coming from the Quakers, did we not? But guess what was going on over in Europe during all this time and prior to it? Was the Renaissance. What we think of the Renaissance is the rebirth of light. But guess what happened during the Renaissance? That's when we reached a zenith of the witch hunts and of the goddess killings, of the Inquisition, where the Inquisition killed approximately 9 million goddess worshipers throughout Europe because they would not convert to the new religion. They were part of the old religion, and Christianity could not stamp them out, could not win them over, so they just decided to kill them. It was just the easiest thing to do. And that's what was behind the Inquisition. So we have is the goddess tradition, the old religion of Europe, is being crucified. That's why I use this image right here. Here's a German witch burning in 1555. Here's another one of a witch hanging in Scotland in 1571. And guess what we're getting ready to see that happens here in America? And only happened through a 9-month period of going totally crazy here in this country. But this is why our founding fathers, one of the reasons why they were so adamant about the separation of church and state, because in 1692, in Salem, Massachusetts, we had the Salem witch trials, and we killed women and men. Two-thirds of the ones that were hanged were women, 1/3 were men. But this is where you had a total coming together, a total union of church and state, because they were able to kill people because only the state could kill them, but they were tried for heresy because thinking that they were devil-possessed, and which we know that it was, well, there's many different theories on it, but little girls made up some stories, and the more attention they got, the bigger the stories got, and more people got indicted. And here is the tombstone of Sarah Good, hanged in 1692. Well, what follows that is known as the Great Awakening in American religious history. The Great Awakening started in the 1730s in New England, and what it was a reaction to the rationalism coming out of the Enlightenment, that the idea that we could reason with our mind, and that was a way to get to know God, and also to the new materialism that was running rampant through America, because that's been part of the American psyche, that's been part of the American personality. But basically the Great Awakening says, give me that old-time religion. And now, interestingly enough, the Baptists came on the scene as part of this Great Awakening in the 1730s, and they were the reformers. They were very progressive. They opposed slavery. They instituted their own code of sobriety and of self-control, and they were very egalitarian. Now, the interesting thing about the code of sobriety, y'all probably know what the great 3 religious truths are, don't you? About who recognizes whom, is that the great 3 religious truths are that Protestants do not recognize the Pope as infallible, right? That was what the Protestant Reformation was about. The Jews do not recognize Jesus as the Son of God, and Baptists do not recognize each other in liquor stores. The 3 great religious truths. It started right here where they instituted their own code of sobriety. They also were this was the period of the beginning of revivalism in America, and through this Great Awakening, all the Puritan ideas got extended universally across America. So now this is how the Puritan teachings get spread out from just up in New England to pretty much pervade America as we know it back then, which is still part of some of the issues that we deal with in our own consciousness today, the idea of Puritanism. Well, let's take a look at one of my heroes here, Jefferson. What did Thomas Jefferson have to say about the separation of church and state? He was adamant about this, as was James Madison. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and here's what Jefferson had to say. Well, going back to in 1786, Jefferson wrote Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, which ended all practice of state-supported religion in Virginia. He went on and was very concerned about that if churches were united with government, that there would be tyranny. So he believed that the power of organized religion, and he once wrote this, has been severely felt by mankind and has filled the history of 10 or 12 centuries with too many atrocities not to merit a proscription from the meddling with government. He was deeply anti-dogma. He was deeply anti-exclusivist religion. He was deeply anti any type of concentrated power. He was anti anything without there being checks and balances, which brings about abuse. Now let's take a look at this great quote that Jefferson has here. This is very powerful. I have examined all the known superstitions of the world, and I do not find in our particular superstition of Christianity one redeeming feature. Millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. What has been the effect of this coercion? To make one half of the world's fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth. You know, it's just too bad that he couldn't have been a little softer there. I mean, a little harsher, a little more, have a little bit more edge with what he had to say, a little clearer. He was a little too diplomatic. Anyway, Jefferson did have great contempt for religion. And why? Because he and the founding fathers had looked all through the history of Europe, and the abuses that took place throughout Europe, the mass killings and the wars were inspired by religion, were fought over ideology, that my way is right. And that was the history of Europe, constant warfare. The founding fathers were determined that there would be separation of church and state, and Thomas Jefferson championed that cause more than anybody. Here in the Jefferson Bible, let me go back to this. This is the Bible that Jefferson wrote. Let me say, what he did was he took the New Testament. I've talked about this. He cut up the passages that he felt were authentic to Jesus, and the ones that he knew didn't sound like Jesus were commercials for the church. They were man-made. They were ones about domination and control. He just got rid of those. He did this intuitively. Shortly after Thomas Jefferson, there would be a movement to start in Germany that would be the beginning of modern biblical scholarship that would do the same thing, but looking at it from a literary critical tradition of separating the earlier writings from later writings, looking for the anachronisms in there. Jefferson did this intuitively. He's the great mystical mind behind the founding of this country. Then, coming from the Jefferson Bible is this great quote that Jefferson had to say, "The time will come when the mystical generation of Jesus by the Supreme Being as his father in the womb of a virgin will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva from the brain of Jupiter." This idea of a virgin birth was abhorrent to Jesus. It's like, this doesn't make any sense. It's just a fairy tale. It has great symbolic meaning, but if you take it literally, it creates a tremendous amount of dysfunction. So what we have coming out of the founding of this country and what Jefferson was bringing forth is known as the Second Great Awakening. And what took place during the Second Great Awakening from 1800 to 1825 is the Methodists really came on the scene in a very big way. They grew rapidly after the war. The frontier became a counterculture. The early hippie movement was the frontier of those days. And they became the largest denomination of 1860. And if you know the Methodist teaching, it's very open, it's very direct, very simple, and it doesn't have the guilt that some of the other teachings have. So it became very, very popular. Out of the Second Great Awakening, there was the reform movements arose. Those of temperance and of anti-slavery, the women's rights movement, there were very beginnings of it, and women preachers came on the scene. Whoa, they're pushing the envelope big time here. Deeply progressive. Now, some of the ones who were part of the women's suffrage movement was Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker minister, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were both evangelical abolitionists, very progressive. In 1848, there was the Seneca Falls Women's Convention, and it was held in a Methodist church in Seneca Falls, New York. And that really was the epitome of this idea of being progressive religious thought here, of bringing women forward. Now, what we see coming as a result of the Second Great Awakening and the spreading of the Methodist teachings here is, we'll look at the African American religion, because the Methodist teachings appeal to the African Americans very much. And because, again, of their straightforward message. And also what the African Americans brought to the religion was a very emotional response to God, and a great emotional devotion, and a deep, sincere religious feeling. And if you've ever been to a black service, you know how true that is. It's deeply emotional and deeply sincere. It's borders on being mystical from the standpoint is you do feel something very powerful in that presence. There is a very pure connection there. The African Americans also had a very strong identification with Israel's bondage and with Jesus. So this message spoke to them very strongly. And then, of course, in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin comes on the scene, the great literary piece that intensifies the debate about slavery. And during this time, the southern colonies, the southerners, used the Bible to condone slavery. Well, the Bible's been used for anything you want to use it for throughout history. It's on both sides of any argument. But at this point, we start getting a great division in religions here. Then we get on the scene are the Mormons. And how many of y'all are familiar with the Mormons and Joseph Smith? Well, maybe y'all could talk about this, but I'll just give you briefly this thing. If you want to make any comments, just please do. But in 1826, as the story goes, Joseph Smith met with the angel Moroni, who gave Joseph Smith the golden tablets. And in the golden tablets, it talked about that the lost tribes of Israel actually are over here in America. That's who the Native Americans were. And that Jesus came here too after he had finished with his mission in Palestine. And they also, with Joseph Smith, as he established this religion based on these golden tablets that were given to him by the angel Moroni, he also practiced polygamy. Well, that didn't go over real well in this country at all. And particularly out in the frontier where there weren't as many women, so a lot of people were pretty jealous of that. And he was lynched in 1844. Brigham Young picks up the cause of the Mormons, and he ends up taking the group to Utah. And they found their colony at the Great Salt Lake, as you know the history of that. And so Mormons are one of the ones that come on the scene as a result of the Second Great Awakening and this idea that we're opening up more religious thought here in America. It's starting to expand. It's starting to get bigger. Then what we have is the Catholic immigration that starts to take place here. And what happens in the Catholic immigration, in the South and the Southwest, the Catholics come in the 1500s. In 1630, the Catholics come in and found Maryland. And from the 1820s to the 1850s, they immigrate from Ireland. In the 1840 on, they start immigrating in from Germany. Strong German tradition here. Matter of fact, do you know what the largest ethnic, cultural population is in America? The number one group today? Germans. German ancestry is the number one. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, we'll look at that a little bit next week. But in 1848, with the Mexican War, then we get the influx. Once we take on this new territory that was Mexico, we now also have this mass new population, not really immigrant. They just all of a sudden became Catholic Mexicans who were assimilated as Americans. And then in the 1880s, we get more Catholic immigrants coming from Poland and from Italy. Now, moving back over to the spiritual roots and the spiritual stream from looking at what was going on in religion here in America, during this same period of time, we have George Hegel, great German philosopher, who comes on the scene and has a huge, huge influence in America's spirituality. What Hegel taught was that there was a way to know the spiritual truth, and it was through your own intuition. And that was very similar to George Fox of the Quakers, who preached the inner light was the way to truth. Now, Hegel was a believer of monism. Monism is where God is singular. God is the only force. There is no separate force equal to God. There is no God in the devil. There is no God in Satan. That it is all God and that it is all positive. Hegel taught that the processes of life, that all the stuff that we go through in life would be that would bring about positive results and positive growth. Yes, we may go through negative things, but it always ended up positive. We might call Hegel the first optimistic in the world that we know of, because he is so optimistic here, and he is definitely a mystic. But Hegel taught that truth was inclusive of all sides of life, and that truth was paradoxical. Well, if we are paying attention to our life today, we realize how true that statement is, that all life is paradoxical, that life includes both sides of the equations, and both are simultaneously true. Matter of fact, there's multiple sides of truth in any situation today. And it is our great mind and it is our great heart that can hold these paradoxical truths, to see both simultaneously as true and real. And that they're actually not even opposed, but they are complementary. And then Hegel talked about that the human reason was an expression of spirit. That by thinking about things, by using our human intellect, that was a way that we could know God, that we could know spirit. Hegel's, probably his greatest contribution is known as Hegel's dialectic. Some of y'all familiar with Hegel's dialectic in here? Well, this is really wonderful. And I love this format. What he says is that you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and this is the path of life. That you begin at any point with thesis, a beginning point, also known as first cause. And what happens is, just think of it as an idea. You get an idea of something new you want to bring forward, or a new behavior you want to be, or a new person you want to be. And you go out into the world, you share it with some of your relatives and some of your friends, and guess what you're going to run up against is second force, the antithesis. All the people saying, you can't do that. Who do you think you are? You're not smart enough. You're not pretty enough. You can't manifest that. All those negative thoughts, some of those come from within our own head that we're not good enough. That is second force the way Hegel sees it. So you have first force, thesis, original idea. Going forth to be manifested hits all the resistance in the world. And many people get killed right there, or ideas get killed off right there with that second force energy. But Hegel says that second force is not a bad thing. Second force is a blessing, because what happens is that when we get to that second force energy, that as we move through second force, as we gobble it up, it's energy that inspires us. It's learning how to overcome all of the naysayers, all the negativity in the world. And when you hit second force, what happens is you think of you're traveling along on a horizontal path from first force to second force to antithesis, and when you get here and you overcome it, it shoots you up vertically to third force, to synthesis. And that synthesis is now you're at a new consciousness, you're a new level of vibration, a new energy. You have now manifested that. You have now realized that. And it was because of second force, because of the antithesis, or some would call that the Satan factor, if you look at it religiously. Because of that, you were able to become this new person. You were able to move through it. So Hegel is saying that everything is a blessing. All these struggles that we go through are blessings for us. They are gifts for us. What a dynamic teaching. That's part of the mystical tradition that is behind the great mysticism and metaphysical movements here in America. Hegelian thought. Then we come to my personal all-time favorite. And the reason why I want to talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson here is he was the father of the metaphysical religions and metaphysical movement here in America. He's the one who popularized it, and he's the one who opened more people up to it. He was a Unitarian minister who left the pulpit because he couldn't say the things on Sunday morning that he could on Wednesday night, so he left the pulpit and became a lecturer to start saying the things that needed to be said. I love Emerson because when I read Emerson, I got to understand God like I never understood God before, because it was a mystical experience for me to read Emerson, because my mind would be exploding. He stretches you so far to see the bigger picture. Well, in 1838, Emerson gave the Divinity School address at Harvard, and in this address, he has a very powerful statement, and he asked the question at Harvard, why can't I have a firsthand and immediate experience of God? Why can't I have a firsthand immediate experience of God? They would have burned people in Europe for that. They would have hung somebody for even thinking that, much less saying it outside, in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. And he comes from Concord, Massachusetts. Radical idea, but that's what Emerson is all about. Having a firsthand and immediate experience of God that we all can, that it is natural to us. He saw Jesus as what we all will become, or what we can become. He saw Jesus as the great way-shower. He saw that miracles were nothing more than the operation of divine law. They were a natural state of things. They were nothing abnormal at all. Matter of fact, he would say something that the Course in Miracles would later echo, that if you're not experiencing miracles in your life, then something's wrong. Then you're out of the natural flow of life. He saw Jesus and everyone equally divine. That's a radical, radical thought. He just saw the only difference was it's just a matter of degree between us and what Jesus had manifested in conscious and in his humanity. As others have done, as Buddha has, as Lao Tzu had. Hinduism had a great effect on Emerson as well. He started bringing in a lot of Eastern concepts here. And one of the things that Emerson taught was this, is make your own Bible. Make your own Bible and let it be out of inspirational ideas and read that Bible every day, because that was the greatest Bible there was the one that was written by you. The one that was a collection of the most inspirational thoughts that we could possibly have. Don't you just love that? Here we are starting to get into cafeteria religion, the beginning of it, where we get to select from here and from here and here and take the best. He went on to say, the highest revelation is that God is in everyone. Emerson also taught that about prayer. He said prayer is contemplation of facts from the highest point of view. What does that mean? Prayer is contemplation of facts from the highest point of view. Well, think about it this way. The highest point of view is the big picture. What is the greatest prayer? Is to be able to see the big picture, to get on the big picture. When we get on the big picture, guess what happens? All the sting, the trauma, the hurt, and most of all the victimhood that we lock ourselves into gets taken away when we move to the big picture, because you cannot be a victim and be on the big picture simultaneously. It is impossible, because the little picture is where we go into victimhood. But when you see how everything is working together for our healing, for our evolution, for our empowerment, then we are contemplating facts from the highest point of view. That is the highest, ultimate prayer there is to see the big picture. I learned in 1988 this firsthand in a very powerful way. And that was when I was going through the dark night of my soul the second time. Oh, they're so much fun, you just got to repeat them sometimes, you know? Either that or I'm just not the brightest crayon in the box where I had to repeat this. And so what I went through was all of my beliefs being just shattered and taken away from me, and I was just left empty. Anybody ever been there? Confused at the very bottom, wanting to check out because it was not fun being here and you didn't think you could make it. And I said there had to have been something that I saw that was so beautiful for me to want to sign up for this, to learn to go through this. And my prayer became at that moment, let me see from the eyes of my soul. Let me see from the eyes of my soul. It's what Emerson said that prayer was. And that was my highest prayer. That was my daily mantra ever since then. And I've gotten so deeply connected to my soul because that's been an incessant daily mantra. Let me see from the eyes of my soul. Let me see the big picture, because that's where the great healing can come in. Emerson went on to say that nature hates monopolies and exceptions. And I love this quote because it helps make more sense of that other one. That things refuse to be mismanaged for long. Oh, this comes from the essay on compensation. This is one of the greatest quotes all time ever. And boy, it's a lot of confirmation and comfort for us today, is not? That things refuse to be mismanaged for long. The universe doesn't allow that, because in his great essay on compensation, he talks about how nature always balances everything out. The universe demands balance, no matter what. Nothing arbitrary, nothing artificial can endure. Another great Emerson quote. The universe is represented in every one of its particles. Everything in nature contains all the powers of nature. God, isn't that great? Then he goes on to say, cause and effect, means and ends, seeds and fruit cannot be severed. For the effect already blooms in the cause, the end pre-exists in the means, the fruit in the seed. I love this. Think about that. The end pre-exists in the means. What would Gandhi come along and tell us? The same thing? That the means is the ends. This is what Martin Luther King based his civil rights movement on as well. But the idea is that the ends does not justify the means, as many people who live in a dualistic world, who live with this separation from God, believe that the ends justifies the means. And Emerson and every great mystic and anybody who's been able to tap into God directly knows that that just doesn't work. That the means are no different from the ends. They are one and the same. And in this world of collapsing, time collapsing realities that we have as we're becoming more and more fourth dimensional, we know that cause and effect are no longer cause and effect. It's cause-effect. It's all one word. It all happens together. Everything happens quick. How many of y'all have had quick visits from Captain Karma? That karma comes back right away? Karma gets paid pretty quickly right now. There's very little lag between when you're off on something and what shows up to remind you. And what is karma? Karma is education. It is not punishment. Karma is education. Karma is here to teach us, not to punish us, not to hurt us. It's just to wake us up, to allow greater conscious evolution within us. That's what karma is about. It is a great friend. It's part of the operative universe. So Emerson would go on to say, never pass up an opportunity to put God in your debt. What does that mean? Think about that, to put God in your debt, about doing good, because you're compelling the universe to be with you. So Emerson has more to say. Our young people are diseased with theological problems of original sin, origin of evil, predestination, and the like. Some things never change, do they? I love that. I mean, he lays it out there too, just like Jefferson did. The guidance for each of us, and by lowly listening, there is a guidance for each of us, and by lowly listening, we shall hear the right word, listening to that inner voice. So much of what Emerson was about. He went on to say, each man has his own call. The talent is the call. How many of us are looking for what our right purpose is in life, our right path, our next path? How many of us have had 4 incarnations this lifetime? Okay? Or more. 4 lifetimes in a lifetime. Well, guess what? When we're always looking for what is our right purpose in life, Emerson lays it out, talent is the call. Whatever our talent is what our right livelihood should be. There is no bar or wall in the soul where man, the effect, ceases and God, the cause, begins. There is no separation between man and God, woman and God, humanity and God. Revelation is disclosure of the soul. Think about that one. Revelation. When you have a revelation, when you get this aha experience that hits you up here in the third eye, or hits you in your heart, or hits you in your gut, that is direct communication from the soul. And Emerson understood that the soul is where it was all at. We'll talk about that maybe before at the end here. I'll follow up on that. About this idea of revelation is disclosure of the soul. Then he would say, our strength comes out of our weakness. Very much like Hegel, about what happens with second force, and you move through it to synthesis, is to become synthetic up here, where you encompass the antithesis of the second force, and you move to third force. And what in Hegel's model, that new third force up here of synthesis was your new launching pad, your new beginning for your new thesis that you would go forward again into hit your next antithesis. They would force you up into a new synthesis, and that life, even though this is a very linear model, life was a stair-step progression of consciousness, ability, humanity, and love. That we were meant to overcome every single thing. And this is where Emerson is picking up on, saying our strength comes out of our weakness. How many of us have had to dive into something that we were deficient in, and because we were so deficient, we worked hard and it became our strength, right? It happens all the time. 5 years ago, I was computer illiterate. 5 years ago, I didn't want anything to do. I couldn't type, I didn't want to do any of that. And as a result of something that set me up with my secretary leaving, that was my biggest vulnerability and weak spot that I was aware of at the moment. Well, at least that's the one that my soul presented to me. And I had to dive into it. And as a result, there's really nothing I can't do with a computer today, and even making movies, long one. But that's what happens, that life always exploits our weaknesses so that they can become strengths for us. That everything is basically happening for us. So Emerson goes on, with every precaution you take against such an evil, you put yourself in the power of evil. The more you rail against evil, the more you bring evil into you. The more you have a belief and fear of evil or the devil, the more you bring it into your life. Because as Gandhi would say, Christianity is a religion of the devil. It worships the devil more than it does God. It has greater fear of the devil than it does love of God. Interesting comment. Very interesting comment. Emerson is saying the same thing. Emerson goes on, one man's justice is another's injustice, as one beholds the same objects from a higher point of view. Wow. Wow. Then, again, he's talking about getting to that higher point of view. In his essay on circles, and we're going to take a big picture view here, I'll summarize what he has to say. It's fantastic. He says that all of life is a circle, that you just draw a circle, and where we are right now is this circle. And what we do when we enter this circle, that we go to fill out different parts of that circle. We fill it out as far as we can go until there's nothing left to fill out. And then we have to break out of it, like breaking out of an egg. And he says at that point, you must draw a larger circle. And that you then go to fill that out. And this is the expansion of consciousness, the expansion of energy, the expansion of vibration. That we go to fill out these circles. And then we are continually drawing the larger circles, meaning we're becoming larger. That means we're becoming more inclusive. We can hold larger thoughts, greater thoughts, more comprehensive thoughts. Isn't that powerful? Isn't that beautiful? Well, what else does Emerson have to tell us? Money often costs too much. Isn't that great? Money often costs too much. That's pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? Beware, now I love this one. Beware when the great God lets loose a thinker on this planet, then all things are at risk. Of course, religion would say, then we have to kill him, get rid of him one way or another. It's kind of the same thing that happens in corporate America. Y'all know the mantra in corporate America, the unwritten rule, is that in every corporation, every company, there is one person who knows everything that's going on. This person must be fired. So, here's Emerson's essays, which is one of my all-time favorite books just to read. He's so profound and so direct. Then we get a part. Emerson is the father of he's really not the father of the Transcendentalist movement, because it actually started just a little ahead of him, but he becomes the main voice of the Transcendentalist and the great essayist. And of course, Henry David Thoreau was the next one that comes out of that. This is all part of the foundation of America's spirituality, of America's metaphysical movements and religions. And not even religions, just the metaphysical arena, this spiritual arena of the consciousness movement. All comes out of Emerson here and then Thoreau. Thoreau would say, I am a citizen of the world first and of this country at a later and more convenient hour. Now, I love that. Thoreau was the great one who talked about civil disobedience, but think about this. That statement couldn't be more timely than today. That we are citizens of the world first and of this country at a later and more convenient hour when it's right, but blind patriotism isn't the ticket. And one of the worst things that can happen in the world today is nationalism, because nationalism is what causes wars of thinking my way is right. It's no different than exclusivist religion. It's the same energy. Is that we have to think in transnational terms today, that we are citizens of the earth first, we are citizens of our country, but never to the exclusion of looking at the good of the whole, always. Then, of course, he goes on to say, and you know this one, if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. How many of us have been listening to a different drummer ever since you started waking up to the spiritual path? How loud has that drum gotten? Or have we silenced that drum? Because maybe that's the great thing, is when we can listen to that drum, because that is our soul. That is the revelation and disclosure that Emerson is talking about, of leading us in a different direction. It takes great courage to do that, to not be a conformist. Anyway, let him sleep to the music he hears, however measured or far away, is the end of that great quote. Then here's another one you might know of Thoreau. Most men lead quiet lives of desperation and go to their graves with the song still in them. Wow. With their song still left in him and her. Is that not perhaps the greatest despair in life? Is that not maybe the ultimate depression in life, is when our music is left in us? When we haven't been able to get all of our energy, all of our song out of us, all of our creativity. The greatest thing, my father used to say to me, the greatest thing that can happen to us is to be thrust on our own resources. Because when we are thrust on our resources, we have to bring out more of us. Bringing out more of our song. Having to be creative in meeting the challenges of life. Is that not what this is about? Then Thoreau goes on. If one advances confidently in the direction of your own dreams and endeavors to live the life which you have imagined, you will meet with success unexpected in common hours. I love that. Here's another optimistic, right? Seeing that life is always working for us, that nothing is really working against us, that it's that basically coming out of that Hegelian thought of Hegel, is that second force energy, that Satana energy. By the way, in the Bible, if you know from Satan comes from the word Satana, and in Hebrew, as well as in Aramaic, Satana literally means the adversary, not a being, the adversary, the adversarial force. The adversary is always our greatest friend, because that's who shows us our weaknesses. That's what allows us to develop more of who we are. And we piss and moan about the adversary out there, and yet it is the very thing that pushes us up to the next level, that synthetic place of being that Hegel talked about, that third force. It is our greatest gift, is to be able to go through those and grow through those challenges. That's the success in uncommon hours that we would meet with. Then we come into the Civil War, and you remember what happened in the Civil War? Lincoln sees slavery as America's greatest sin and a punishment, because we hadn't dealt with slavery, and we had to kill 465 men died in the Civil War fighting this battle, and we're still fighting the battle of racism today. It has still not left us because we didn't deal with it at the founding of this country. It's an ugly legacy. It's not the only one, but one of the ugly legacies that's left behind in our conscience that we're still dealing with. And religions today are still split over it, religious factions. Lincoln knows that God is on both sides. I love this idea. He never prayed that God was on our side, because he knew that God was on both sides, as God is on both sides in anything, and he thought it was ridiculous to think about praying for God to be on your side in a battle. What Lincoln does, and Lincoln has a great spiritual character to him and understanding. And he proposes out of this greatness, this idea of this magnanimous reconstruction. He does not want to destroy the South. He does not want to punish the South. He wants to bring them back into the fold, and he instructs Grant to tell the Confederate soldiers that they can return home even with their sidearms if they just promise not to take up arms against us. Is that a place of trust? But you also know, and I've said this many times, but this is part of the American Bible, and it comes from Lincoln. And nothing can be more relevant and understanding and dealing with foreign affairs today if we want to heal this on the biggest picture, the most effective way and the most efficient way, and that is Lincoln's great statement, "Do I not destroy my enemy when I make him my friend?" Do I not destroy my enemy when I make him my friend? That's as pure as it gets. But it takes a big soul to be able to hold that thought. It takes a big heart to be able to implement that thought. How about that in our own personal lives, when we make a friend of what we call our enemy, because it's the enmity within us is the problem. It's not that person out there. They are nothing more than a reflection of the enmity that we hold within us. Well, out of the Civil War, religions become very divided here. But here's what Abraham Lincoln had to say about religion. This was his religion. When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That's my religion. Now that's pretty simple and straightforward, isn't it? Nobody's going to build a church to that one. No reason to give salvation in the collection plate, because that's as pure as it gets. When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. And it's by living from that feeling that we know that we're living the highest path. Feelings are very important because they are the language of the soul, and learning to monitor ourselves according to how does something feel in the moment. If we need to make a decision, how does this feel? If we got the decision to think about something we're going to do next week, how about trying it on? How does this feel? So simple. How does this feel? What great guidance. It's the purest way to cut through all the mental chatter that's going on. How does this feel? Well, let's move on here. After the Civil War, America becomes very industrial. The urban centers are emerging with a large middle class. There is great affluence that is taking place here with the Industrial Revolution. The Seventh-day Adventists are founded here as one of the new religions, and it's founded on dietary restrictions. Women start to become very prominent in religion, believe it or not, after the Civil War. There's a progressive period going on here, huge healing. Something else took place just before the war broke out. In 1859, we have Darwin's theory of evolution. Now that rocks religion big time, because it's challenging the old Bible stories and the infallibility of the Bible. They're saying that humans were in a physical evolution, that they just weren't created in 6 days the earth created in 6 days and man in 1 day, just by God, by divine fiat. So what happens here, this is again the opening up of very progressive thinking again. So we're going to cause a tremendous explosion in religions as a result of this, and we're going to find a tremendous contraction of those who cannot hold the larger ideas. And modern Bible scholarship starts to appear on the scene, plus archaeology is a brand new science that is invented. And what archaeology is doing is helping us develop comparative religions when we start finding older stories. And what we realized with comparative religious studies coming out of archaeology here was that what we call the Bible wasn't divine revelation as we used to think. We now realize that it was borrowed from the Sumerian text, and the Epic of Gilgamesh was the basis for Noah. And we started to realize that so much of what we see in the Bible was borrowed from earlier cultures and earlier religious traditions. So we realized, oh, then maybe there's more to the story than this. And the modern literary criticism came in out of Germany. And what's so really wonderful about this would open up us to a whole new scriptural interpretation of life, of seeing things in an allegorical, symbolic sense, because we realize that the Bible was written at many different times by many different authors, that the sources were not divine as we had previously thought, that we realized that Moses did not write the first 5 books of the Bible. He couldn't have written them because he was already dead before the first one began to be written, because of the anachronisms in there. And we started doing critical analysis, and we started seeing the layer traditions of the writing of the Bible. And in this fall, I'm going to be teaching a class called The Jesus Story here, and that's going to be one of the primary ways we're going to be using the Bible to uncover the truth, is looking at the layer traditions. Earlier layers show earlier theology, later traditions, later layers show a entirely different theology. And you want to always get back to the earliest layer, because that's going to be the closest to being authentic. And the later traditions, the later layers, are those that are man-made, made up stuff to promote the church, the ones that have the commercials in it. Anyway, so modern Bible scholarship comes out of Germany, and it starts to challenge people, and many religions embrace it, many new thinkers embrace it, and some religions just do not. Here's the great book that seemed to prompt so much of this, was The Life of Jesus by Ernest Renan. This book was written in 1863, and it's starting to look at the human side of Jesus. Whoa, that's controversial in that moment in time, but not for the free thinkers and the free radicals. So what happens, how does this play out in America, in the evolving metaphysical spiritual stream of America? Mary Baker Eddy founds Christian Science in 1879 based on her own self-healing. However, she was a student of Phineas Parker Quimby, who taught her mental science and about healing, but always done in a group. Mary Baker Eddy's great contribution in Christian Science was about teaching self-healing. Christian Science is based on self-healing. It's a very powerful system of prayer and what we can do ourselves. And it was revolutionary. Now, one thing that happens with Mary Baker Eddy is that she basically is the first one to found a metaphysical religion in America. Matter of fact, there were no metaphysical religions anywhere in the world until this time. Remember this stream that goes all the way back to Plato? That's just been a thought, a philosophical stream about the pre-existence of the soul. The idea that we can have direct communication with God doesn't exist as a formalized religion until Mary Baker Eddy comes on the scene. And so then we get all these, there's many other metaphysical religions that are going to come out of this, and the reason why is Mary Baker Eddy ended up closing the end of her religion. It was no longer allowed to be added to. It was a religion that was closed with her death, and it says this is the ultimate truth. You cannot add to it, and that is the downfall of Christian Science today, is that it has not been able to keep up with the new advances of science, of medicine, but understanding it in its time, she was so far ahead of everybody in 1868 when she had her great healing, in 1879 when she founded this religion. She was way ahead of science and way ahead of medicine at that moment, because she had been an invalid for 40 years of her life, and it was through this self-healing that she learned, this healing technique she learned through Quimby, and then when she was on her deathbed after Quimby had died and she healed herself, that became the foundation of Christian Science. And so she says she didn't want anybody to mess with it because she was afraid it would be contaminated with the thought of science and the thought of medicine in that moment in time, which was far inferior to her own. While it seemed to be relatively good, it's become a big problem because she closed off that teaching to anything else new coming in. Well, what happens soon after this, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore are students of Mary Baker. They don't come out of Mary Baker, but they studied Mary Baker Eddy as they studied many other people, Emma Curtis Hopkins as well, and they found unity around 1888 when they started publishing a little pamphlet that later became Unity, and I'm using that date as trying to see the foundation of unity. Now, what's interesting about Charles Fillmore is he's really very much the opposite of Christian Science while saying the same things, but he's opposite in this one sense. Unity has always meant to be an open-ended teaching. It is never meant to be closed. Matter of fact, it was never meant to be a religion. It was never meant to be a church and never meant to have any ordained ministers. Charles Fillmore only did that as a kind of a reluctance after getting so much pressure from so many people who wanted to be ordained and wanted to spread this around. Because his great statement was, I reserve the right to change my mind. Always, he said, whatever I say today, that may change tomorrow if I get new and better information. Well, that drove people nuts. That perhaps is part of the downfall of unity, is that it's not a closed system where you can build up big churches because it's very open-ended. It was meant to be an add-on to wherever you went during that day. On Sunday, you were to go to the unity services at night and just add on to whatever religious background you came from. One of the great things about Charles Fillmore was, where he took issue with Mary Baker Eddy, was Mary Baker Eddy stressed that the absolute world, the world of pure spirit, she said that's all that's real, and everything that is not of that world is unreal, meaning matter, meaning our physical bodies. She would go on to say that there is no life, intelligence, or substance in matter, meaning our physical body. I totally disagree with her on that. I grew up in that religion, so I can do this. And I couldn't disagree with that more, because we do know that there's life, intelligence in every single cell of our body. We can affect healing. Myrtle Fillmore affected a healing in her body by talking to her cells. Once she heard from this lecture in 1886 from E.B. Weeks, and she got out of this lecture and she was terminal. She had just a few months left to live with a tubercular condition, and she heard these words somehow or another in that lecture, whether they were said or not, but she walked away realizing that I am a child of God. I do not inherit sickness, and all of her family had been one of inherited fatal disease. And so at that moment she had a healing and lived on for another 40 years, and she only was 2 to 3 months away from dying, according to the doctors. So unity is founded out of not only physical healing for Charles Fillmore as well as Myrtle, but also one out of prosperity, because that's one of the great things that Charles Fillmore talks about is prosperity. And he would have to say, he would say that don't frustrate the divine flow, that the divine flow is natural to everybody. Matter of fact, he would have a huge influence on Norman Vincent Peale, who we all know of, right? Norman Vincent Peale went to Unity Village once to give a lecture that he was invited by Eric Butterworth to go over there, the great Unity minister out of New York City. And Norman Vincent Peale said that it was Charles Fillmore that changed his life and turned his life around from being just a mediocre minister who just had a struggling congregation. And as he read Fillmore and listened to Fillmore and got to know Fillmore, he's like, this turned his whole life around. He credits Charles Fillmore with that. Of course, we know, and we'll see this in a little bit, the power of positive thinking. Anyway, what goes on here is after Fillmore and the founding of Unity, Elizabeth Cady Stanton publishes the Women's Bible in 1895. Then William James goes on, who's the father of American philosophy, to say, the greatest discovery of my generation is that a man can alter his life simply by altering the attitude of his mind. Change your thoughts, change your life. Very basic metaphysical principle. And yet, this was a radical thing, but this is this great progressive flowering that is taking place here in America towards the end of the century. And then we get the great architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, who says this, I believe in God, only I spell it nature. I love that. I believe in God, only I spell it nature. Who does that sound like? Our Native Americans, our Indian ancestors. Very strongly, does not. So what comes up next is, now that we've had this great flourishing of progressive thought, we have the modernist to emerge. The modernist will see the Bible as certainly not scientific anymore, but only as metaphorical. So we're going to extend this idea into religions as well as to mainstream thought. The modernists saw that the essential goodness of humanity needed to be emphasized over the innate depravity of humanity, coming from the Calvinist, coming from the literalist. That we focus on the goodness and not the depravity. The modernists emerge, and what do they see? They see Christianity as an ethical teaching, and that the Sermon on the Mount is more important than the resurrection. Now think about that. If we focused on the Sermon on the Mount, the teachings of telling us how to live, how to be empowered, how to have a closer relationship with God, if that was focused on, as opposed to this idea of an event, of someone dying on our cross for sins that we never committed, this is a radical departure. It's a whole new way of salvation, because the idea of salvation is now that we do it with ourselves. The modernists would say that the kingdom of heaven is here on earth right now, not in the afterlife. And they would take up the cause of evolution and a modern Bible scholarship, and they found great breakthroughs by having this in their own personal lives and in some of the influences they would have in religion as well. But there was going to be tremendous tension that was going to emerge, because now we're going to have started a splitting off. That where we are today begins right here, because the fundamentalists emerge in the 1900s, and everything that they see that's going on is in reaction to this new modern thought, this new progressive wave, and that's second force energy that Hegel talks about. So they come forward in the 1900s. They're rejecting all this new info because it's in contradiction to the literal Bible. Now, guess what happens? Why do we like to accept literal truth? Because we don't have to think. It requires no thought, and we have no ethical decisions to make. It's black and white. It's this or that. Stepford, wives and men, right? So the fundamentalist, this fundamentalist movement says, no, we got to get back to basics. We got to go back to the literal Bible, and so they assert the inerrancy of a literal Bible. And they felt that this new modernist way was undermining the general morality and that evolution compromised God's plan, and we can't have anybody compromising God's plan the way they saw it. So what comes after the fundamentalists here? The evangelicals emerge next. And the evangelicals see everything as between God and the devil. And the evangelicals also believe in denying the human perfectibility of us, and all we are supposed to do is just await the rapture. They become the Zionist supporters, and the reason is they want this idea of Israel founded as a state is because they believe that Jesus cannot come back until all the Jews have been returned to Israel. This plays out in our foreign policy today, this Zionist thinking. The Scofield Bible comes on the scene, and it explains the Bible through these ideas, and that Scofield Bible becomes the Bible of the evangelicals. So they go on to believe that salvation is individual through conversion, and they are basically become against the social reforms of the day and your own personal salvation. And then we go into the pillars of fundamentalism. And here they are. 1, the inerrancy of the Bible. 2, that the miracle stories are literally true. And 3, the virgin birth is literally true. And that there was a physical resurrection of Jesus. And finally, that Jesus died for the atonement of our sins. Well, now we've got this retraction going on here, going back into literalism. And then there's going to be the American spiritual stream is going to take another path going this way. In 1915, Evelyn Underhill writes this famous classic work, Practical Mysticism. It's still in print and still wide read today. Fabulous book. So now we're seeing the mystical stream still going. We're finding the fundamentalist evangelical stream separating here. But what happens here as we go through into World War I, one of the things that happened was, remember where the source of modern Bible scholarship comes from? Out of Germany. And the evangelicals and the fundamentalists think, oh no, this is work of the devil, this is bad. And Germany is the source of this. So when World War II comes up, Germany is seen as this ultimate evil, more so because of more so for their Bible scholarship than for what was going on in the war in Europe, because we really didn't care about it that much. But Protestant ministers started saying from the pulpit that the Belgian nuns were being raped by German soldiers, and this inflamed the American populace. And these stories went all through America in the press about the Belgian nuns being raped. Well, what happens at the end of the war, we found out that every one of those stories was false. None of that took place. It was just hype to get us in the war. Hyped up. Also, we have the fundamentalists and evangelicals looking for a reason to put down modern Bible scholarship. And so there's great embarrassment that takes place. As a result of this, the next time we hear stories coming out of Germany in World War II, we don't want to believe them because we think it's the wolf. We're crying wolf one more time. This is why we didn't believe the stories of the Holocaust and of the plight of the Jews, because we got duped in World War I. Well, what happens right after coming out of World War II, we get the suffrage movement and women getting the right to vote. Here's some of the suffrage stamps in 1915, and then here's the National Women's Party Convention, and of course we know what happens in 1920. Women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. This is very progressive for a lot of churches because women are not supposed to be in the pulpit, except unless they're a very progressive church. Here's something about, and this is interesting, this is the Birth Control Review, published in 1925 from Margaret Sanger. We talked about Margaret Sanger before. Now this is really pushing the envelope. Getting very progressive. Women marching in the streets, they've got the right to vote. Now they're marching in the streets, and they're talking about contraception, which in 1900 was illegal. You would be put in prison for distributing any type of literature about contraception. Women can't have control over their own bodies. They can't have power. Then, of course, we get the great monkey trial in 1925. Oh, this gets fun. And if you know the story of John Scopes, who was a teacher in Tennessee wanting to teach evolution because it was the normal science, and there was a state law that was just passed in Tennessee saying you can't teach evolution because it's against the Bible. And so they tried to enforce this law, and it became this big national event, bigger than OJ. This was dominated everything that was going on. And Clarence Darrow is hired. William Jennings Bryan says he's going to come down and defend the state for free. And then Clarence Darrow is brought in by the ACLU to defend John Scopes. And it's this big trial. The fundamentalists win the battle in the sense is the judge ruled that he was incorrect. He did violate state law for teaching evolution, but he was only fined $100. And the fundamentalists were furious, and William Jennings Bryan was furious. They wanted this to be in prison. They wanted to make a statement that this was a winning one for God. And what happened was that this was a national embarrassment for the whole state of Tennessee and for fundamentalists, and they fell out of favor across the country because it was absurd, the monkey trial. And it made monkeys out of them is what ended up happening. And that's the way America saw it at the time. So fundamentalism kind of had to go into the ground at the time because they really got beaten down even though they won the trial. So yes, they won, but they lost the trial. Now, moving into the spiritual stream here. 1925, this great little book, still in print, fantastic book. It's as relevant today as it was in 1925, The Game of Life and How to Play It. This book influenced so many of the great teachers of the 20th century and of the great religions. It certainly influenced Emmett Fox. In 1926, Science of Mind this book is published, and Ernest Holmes founds religious science. Ernest Holmes was self-taught, but in other words, he did not have any formal education. He was influenced by some of the great minds like Meister Eckhart that we've talked about, Emerson, Mary Baker Eddy, Thomas Troward, Emma Curtis Hopkins were his great influences and teachers. But Ernest Holmes believed that first cause was spirit and mind. Think about Hegel's dialectic here. First cause is our original idea, and he's saying that first cause, that is actually the inspiration of the divine mind, of God right there in first cause always. That God is first cause of everything, is the initial cause of everything, and therefore everything has to end up being good ultimately, because God is behind all of it no matter how it may look. He believed that the subconscious was the creative factory in every one of us, and that every one of us is an evolving soul. And I love this quote, that humanity is divinity wearing a mask. Humanity is divinity wearing a mask. And he would go on to say that to be spiritual is to be normal. That the normal way of life is spiritual awareness, spiritual consciousness, and living spiritually. Very much the way the Native Americans do naturally, having it integrated. Now the interesting thing about, and there's really very little difference between the metaphysical religions, but the one interesting thing that Ernest Holmes seemed to leave out was the idea that soul and spirit was involved in the creation. He seemed to think that it was all a product of the subconscious mind. And that does leave out the idea of soul causing our evolution, or spirit, God, causing our evolution and our growth. Or those could be factors in changing things. Ernest Holmes did not accept the idea of reincarnation, opposite of Charles Fillmore, even though many in the religious science churches do believe in that. Then we have the great teacher, the person who is credited with bringing more people into what is known as New Thought, into the metaphysical religions of the 20th century, was Emmett Fox. Now, Emmett Fox was legendary. He was a very interesting, deeply spiritual, mystical man who was deeply practical. His message was very straightforward. He did services where there was one song, there was one meditation, and there was message. No commercials, no filler, no hoopla. It was just get straight truth, and he delivered straight truth. His services were legendary because he had it grew to 6,000 to 10,000 people on a Sunday for one service. He started out at the Astor Hotel. He had to move to the Manhattan Opera House. From there, he had to move to the New York Hippodrome and ended up at Carnegie Hall. My father used to go up and hear him at Carnegie Hall whenever he could get anywhere near New York back in the 30s and the 40s. And of course, Emmett Fox was my father's probably greatest influence and teacher. And thank God for that, because Emmett Fox was so powerful. Emmett Fox also championed the idea about change your thoughts and then keep them changed. That was how you change things. That our own personal life and our own personal relationships reflect our relationship with God. And if there's something wrong with our relationship with God, it's also because something's wrong with our relationship with ourselves and others. And if there's something wrong with our relationship with others and ourselves, then we have something askew with our relationship with God. And that you worked on them from either side. So our life reflects our relationship with God. He would go on to say, if you have a problem, don't think about the problem, think about God. Think about the biggest picture. And his greatest statement and teaching was that life is consciousness. That says so much. Life is consciousness, that all of our life is a product of our consciousness. And that if we need to change anything in our life, it's more than change our thoughts, it's change our consciousness, expand our consciousness. And everything we do by right of consciousness in life. That everything is an outpicturing of our consciousness. Well, here is another one of his great books, Sermon on the Mount. All these books are still in print. You can find them in any metaphysical bookstore or church. And then what we have coming up following him is The Wizard of Oz, a movie reflecting the spiritual path. And what happens with this one that we're getting in here is we're finding that it was always right there within us, the spiritual path, the yellow brick road. And then we go into World War II. Women go into the workplace. And we have Rosie the Riveter coming on the scene. Women wearing pants. Women getting more out in public. Women earning the money. Taking care of everything. Women develop their masculine energy with their already well-established feminine energy. Women become more balanced as a result of World War II. So now the idea of the feminine energy is getting more out there in the world. And so after World War II, what do we find out? We win the Great War here, and there's a huge religious revival taking place in America. Some just thanking God that we won this one. We were a 12th rate power when we entered World War II, and we emerged as the number 1 industrial nation, economic nation, and military power in the world. Because we turned our industrial strength into a military machine. And interestingly enough, the war minister for Adolf Hitler warned Adolf Hitler before World War II. He said, do not engage the Americans, do not get them in the war, because their great industrial strength can be turned into a military machinery strength, and within 12 months we will not be able to compete with them, and if they're in the war longer than 12 months, we will lose. Told Adolf Hitler this. The same advice came from the Japanese war minister, the one who developed the invasion and bombing of Pearl Harbor, told the same thing to the Emperor of Japan. Do not engage the Americans because their great industrial strength will be turned into military power if they convert it over. And after 12 months, we will not be able to compete with them. We've got to knock them out quick, or don't even think about getting Americans in here. And that's exactly what happened. Kind of interesting advice. Anyway, so coming out of World War II, there's this great religious revival. Church membership soars to about 60% here. In 1954, Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in order to show that we're different from the godless communist. That's why Under God was put in the Pledge of Allegiance. And the term Judeo-Christian becomes a very popular phrase. It had never been used before. Matter of fact, there was tremendous division between Christianity and Judaism, and to talk about Judeo-Christian heritage was a kind of a radical concept, but it became popular then. And of course, Norman Vincent Peale's Power of Positive Thinking comes up. I'll show you, cover that in just a sec. And then Billy Graham had this spectacular success around America. And what happens? European churches wither, membership declines, and American churches soar in membership during this period. In 1947, The Law of the Higher Potential came out by Robert Collier, a very powerful, impacting book. Again, one about the power of the individual and about connecting directly with God. Well, following that, coming out of World War II, we had something that has probably been the greatest boon of anything in the history of America and perhaps the world for bringing people into spiritual thinking, into spiritual consciousness, into spirituality, and that is recovery. The recovery movement, and what Alcoholics Anonymous have done, where people have hit bottom, And the 12-step program is a deeply spiritual program of connecting people with the God of their own knowing. And it has just spawned all kinds, and the recovery movement has branched out in so many different ways. Because basically we all are recovering from Western civilization, from the dysfunction of Western civilization, the dysfunction of patriarchy. We all are recovering from patriarchy, that of domination models, that of exclusivist religion. Those of fear-based religions are fear-based teachings, just fear in general. So the AA phenomenon is huge here. Then we have this that happens in 1951. Now we're going to look at some things as cultural metaphors to reflect where we are in consciousness. The Day the Earth Stood Still, a very powerful movie talking about aliens, and they really are benevolent. They come here to share technology, but we're not ready for it. They try to tell us that we're on a path to destroy ourselves, and then they end up just leaving, and it's a deeply powerful movie, very big movie at the time, but it's reflecting not a fear-based message about other worlds and more advanced civilizations, but one that we're just not evolved enough, nothing could be truer than that. Then we have the great phenomenon that this book sold, I think the last count I heard, 25 million copies this book has sold. Remember Norman Vincent Peale, who credited Charles Fillmore with his movement and his popularity of Power Through Positive Thinking? Well, that was a national bestseller. 1955, we have the Civil Rights Movement born with Rosa Parks, who said, no, no, no. And that was a complete sentence. I will not get up. I'm going to stay here. I'm tired. And that changed everything because that caused us to look at our racism even more so here, and the Jim Crow laws came under attack. And then this movie came out. In 1958, it had been a smash hit on Broadway. Why am I putting South Pacific in here dealing with America's Spiritual Stream? Because this movie confronted our racism in the biggest, boldest way. That's what this whole movie is about. The central song in this movie, which this movie is built around, is Carefully Taught. That we have to be taught how to fear and hate. It has to be drummed in our dear little ear from year to year, that it is taught to us by our parents. We are not born hating these people. We are taught these things. Fantastic movie. One of probably my top 3 movies in spiritual category and all-time movie is this one, because it is so moving and so powerful about confronting our own shadow here. Then we move into the 60s. We have the Civil Rights Movement going on. 1962, school prayer is deemed unconstitutional. And then in 1963, we're not allowed to have Bible reading in our schools, and the 10 Commandments cannot be posted in school because this is not a Christian nation. The Founding Fathers never wanted to be a Christian nation. It was to be a secular nation, a pluralistic nation open to all religions, so there wouldn't be fighting. And then we have the great moon landing in 1969. And this one opens up, I'll come back to the moon landing. But here's something else takes place during the 60s. The pill comes in, the sexual revolution, giving women freedom. That they didn't have to be baby factories, if they didn't want to be baby factories. Then we have The Silent Spring, this wonderful book that brought forward, initiated the environmental movement. Now we're thinking in bigger terms here. When we start thinking environment, we're starting to think as God in nature, God as nature, something that normative religion believes in, that you're here to use and abuse nature, if you take the Bible literally. Then you have the feminine mystique coming on board in 1963, and this is a wake-up call to women. And this fuels the women's movement. Women dissatisfied with just their roles. Women want a greater participation in life, in politics, in public life, and they're addressing their own pain, that there's something empty here. They're not allowed to follow the call of their soul. And following that, we have something that had started earlier in the 1930s and 40s, but it really became big after World War II, and that is the Edgar Cayce teachings and the ARE. And Edgar Cayce had 14,000 trance readings about physical health, about healing things that nobody could heal. And every one of his remedies have proved true, that medical science did not know about at the time. He was phenomenal about that. Another great thing about Edgar Cayce, the great mystic visionary of America, was that he also in these trance readings was able to connect purely to the realm of the soul and brought forth more information about the soul than anybody ever had prior to collectively. And so much that we owe today in our study of the soul comes out of the Edgar Cayce readings. And then you have another great phenomenon, 1969, Eric Butterworth, one of my favorites. Well, actually, one of my 2 or 3 favorites. He's a great unity minister, but he's bigger than unity. He is a modern day Emerson. He writes the book, Discover the Power Within You. Then we also have in 1969, the moon landing, a man walking on the moon. Symbolically, that stands for a man stepping into his feminine energy. And that's where the feminine movement really took off, and the women's movement really got big, right here with this. Because it is, think about the symbolism of this, the energy, a man stepping into his femininity. And that is the healing of humanity, is for men who've been deeply patriarchal and have lived under the patriarchal messages to recover our feminine energy, because it's in our feminine energy that we come into a place of wholeness. And a man cannot come into a place of wholeness till he integrates his feminine energy, his non-dominant sex energy, as a woman must integrate her non-dominant sex energy. Now, does that mean that if you're a woman that all your non-dominant sex energy is masculine? No, you could have a predominant masculine energy, and so your non-dominant sex energy might be feminine. Same with men. Our predominant male energy might be feminine as a male, and yet we're here to integrate and call forward our non-dominant energy to come into a place of wholeness and balance, and that's what this represents spiritually and metaphorically of them. Then we move through the 70s. We have the women's movement coming up here all through the 70s. So feminine energy is out in our face big time about incorporating it. We have the influx of Asian religions. We have in 1973 Roe versus Wade. And what do we talked about this before, that the big symbolic thing about Roe versus Wade, as well as the legal thing, is it's not about abortion. That's the emotional charged issue. It's about, this is the first time in the history of America that women became full citizens of this country. And that's what Roe v. Wade did. It gave women full citizenship, a right to privacy, right to the Bill of Rights, protection under the Bill of Rights. Women never had it until 1973. Well, guess what happens? Now we have the rise of evangelicals here to combat secular humanism as an evil in the world, that we're going to hell in a handbasket because of secular humanism. And the fundamentalists and the evangelicals go to TV to start selling their message. They adopted the new technology, and interestingly enough, we talk about the moral majority was formed by Jerry Falwell around school prayer, abortion, family values, and feminism, objecting to those things. And they became a major political force as a result of that. Now, America's spiritual stream here takes another avenue. The environmental movement is embraced there as part of American spirituality, seeing nature as spiritual. The women's movement, it went political. One part of it went political, but here's what happened with the women's movement. We think it died down. It didn't. It moved into the consciousness movement, into the spirituality movement. That was the feminization of our culture there, and so it became the feminine or the women's spirituality movement, which fed the consciousness movement. Also with the influx of Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, Hare Krishna, and Taoism, the Eastern religions and philosophies. And then we had meditation techniques and springing up everywhere, and Est and Esalen were the originators of this movement. And then we move into the 70s and we get Jonathan Livingston Seagull coming on board, my favorite book in college, deeply spiritual book. And following that, we get, in 1975, A Course in Miracles is published. And The Course in Miracles, how many in here have studied The Course in Miracles and have been changed by The Course in Miracles? Yes. Very powerful teaching, very deeply psychotherapeutic, about breaking down our old belief systems that stand in the way of us having a direct connection with God and finding God within ourselves and experiencing everyday miracles. Then following that, in 1976, we get Wayne Dyer coming on the scene with your erroneous zones. You know, so look at Wayne. Doesn't he look a little different back then? But this is now we're really moving here. Look at this explosion of spiritual message coming forward here. Because following that, we have the first book published on the goddess in 1976, When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone. And this initiates the goddess movement because we now have literature based on archaeological finds talking about what predated the establishment of patriarchal religions, which was only 5,000 years ago, was the goddess religions where we conceived of God as a woman. Oh, is that radical? Well, then we had some more things come up in 1978. The Nag Hammadi Library was discovered where we had biblical texts that we did not know about that were thrown out of the Bible, but yet they were considered scripture at the time. These are the other gospels. This started fueling the fire of more biblical scholarship. 1979, you've got The Road Less Traveled coming up, or 78, great spiritual book here. Norman Cousins wrote the book Anatomy of an Illness, which taught the idea of using laughter to heal an illness. It was about engaging another spiritual aspect of ourselves to overcome an illness. Then, the Gnostic Gospels was written. This is a fantastic book by Elaine Pagels, who was on the original archaeological team with translating the scrolls of the Nag Hammadi Library that were discovered. And she writes a book here that tells us a lot about first century Christianity. Well, then we keep going. Jerry Jampolsky writes, Love is Letting Go of Fear, the condensed version of the Course in Miracles in 1979 that comes out. Then we move into the 80s. In the 80s, the church has become divided over AIDS, over women ministers, and women priests, and gay ordination. And our churches have stayed divided since. The evangelicals have become deeply political ever since then, if we look at what's going on with the religious road. But we also have this happening in the 80s, is Al-Anon. Well, let's see here. Well, it's not moving. Okay. Ooh. Well, now I don't know what's... Yeah. Oh, well. So Al-Anon comes forward, and we have the recovery movement being extended to the families of alcoholics. And again, one more thing taking us further into our spiritual path. Then the Jungian psychology begins a very big play that adds to the spiritual path where it starts to broaden into psychological fields. Because then we see this movie E.T. comes on the scene, and we're starting to look at E.T.'s, extraterrestrial beings, as friendly. No longer are we dealing with fear, and that reflects our letting go of our belief in a God that we must fear. And then this book comes forward here, who is Jackie Small is the founder of, one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, and she is about the blending of psychology and spirituality. If you've never read Jackie Small, I couldn't recommend her higher enough. She's one of my favorite people on the planet and one of my favorite writers. And then Matthew Fox comes on the scene right here with original blessing as opposed to original sin. Matthew Fox, the great mystic coming from within the Catholic tradition. Louise Hay comes on the scene writing You Can Heal Your Life. And out of this little book is one that many of y'all probably have seen. How many of you know this book, Heal Your Body, of dealing with the metaphysical causations behind some illness in your body? Well, what follows that is another great bestseller. Shirley MacLaine comes out of the closet, and we find out she is a radical mystic. And she tells her life story, which she took a lot of heat for in 1983, writing Out on a Limb. And then this is a book from the ARE people. And it's a wonderful book on reincarnation called Born Again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And then we find, anything by John Van Auken, you're right, Gary, is really great. And he was the author of that book. 1985, we're dealing with codependency. Robin Norwood's book, Women Who Love Too Much. Are some of these titles starting to look familiar to you? Coming of the Cosmic Christ by Matthew Fox. Bernie Siegel writes Love, Medicine, and Miracles. Here's one of my all-time favorite books. Matter of fact, it's probably my #1 book to read for about spirituality. The one that has had a huge impact and helped me through the dark night of my soul. But I will say it's channeled material, and I'm not big on channel material because I don't think much of channel material by and large, because it's only as good as the consciousness of the filter it's coming through, and it's just as confused as that. You know, and why would we think that somebody we didn't listen to Uncle Henry when he's here on life, why are we going to listen to him when he's disincarnate now? But this is the purest material I've ever read. It is written purely from the heart. And I just love this book. It is so simple. Matter of fact, if you were to get a copy and read it, you would know, wow, it is the Course in Miracles simplified even more, because it is written from the energy of the heart. Anyway, then we have the great cultural event. 1987, we have a movie, Out on a Limb. It's put on national TV prime time. And Shirley MacLaine is talking about reincarnation and her spiritual journey. Prime time, 2 nights, January of 1987. Imagine this. What a reflection of consciousness it is to see this movie come out there. It is a fantastic movie. Probably another one of the 3 great spiritual movies of all time. Then we have greater biblical scholarship coming forward here with Marcus Borg writing Jesus, A New Vision. Codependent No More is written by Melody Beatty about dealing with codependency. Then in 1988, see this incredible explosion of spiritual, see how broad it's getting here? Of spirituality going into psychotherapy, going into philosophy. Here we have The Power of the Myth. Many of y'all might have seen the series with Bill Moyers and The Power of the Myth. 1988, we have The Chalice and the Blade coming forward, and which is the second great book about the goddess. Then we have my all-time favorite spiritual movie, Field of Dreams. It is the most complete, the most wonderful movie about spirituality. It has nothing to do with baseball, even though it's a kind of nice, convenient story. And I'd love to talk about this one because I've had my own Field of Dreams experience, and I understood this movie personally because of that. But it was a phenomenal statement. Think about this as a reflection of consciousness, a reflection of our spiritual growth, that a movie like this gets made and put out there and was a huge success and had such broad appeal. Then we move on to 1989, and Larry Dossey is writing his great book, Recovering the Soul, and Larry Dossey is one of the great spiritual thinkers, mystics in the medical science field, and who is transforming medical science, where Barney Siegel started out, and a contemporary of his, Deepak Chopra, has picked up as well doing this, expanding medical science into spirituality. Then Gloria Steinem writes her great book, and this shows about what happened with the women's movement, and it's called The Revolution from Within. And this is a book about self-esteem and about spirituality, that the real revolution was not out on the streets, but one that we had to go through internally, and reflecting what women have done and how that's been transforming the society. Codependence Guide to the 12 Steps comes out, another Melody Beatty one. John Bradshaw comes on the scene writing Homecoming about dealing inner child work. 1991, we get another great cultural metaphor, Dances with Wolves, the great movie. And where we finally are getting the truth about Native Americans and looking at them in the most honest way. And it has brought about a huge opening to Native American spirituality, particularly those of the Lakota Sioux, as were championed in this movie. Thelma and Louise is a lot of people's favorite movie because here was a women's empowerment movie. Then we have Creation Spirituality coming from Matthew Fox, furthering the mystical tradition within Christianity and within Catholicism. We have Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism by John Shelby Spong, based on scholarship, deeply spiritual book. Owning Your Own Shadow from Robert Johnson comes up next, which is part of the Jungian thought about dealing with our shadow as part of the spiritual path. Again, the blending of spirituality and politics. When God Becomes a Drug by Leo Booth comes on the scene about recovering from our addiction to God. Then we have a great movie coming here, which is another one of the great, probably one of the 4th great movie, I would say, for spirituality, Defending Your Life. Probably as a teaching tool, it would rank right there with Field of Dreams as teaching spirituality. A comedy that was hysterical and so true about spirituality. But guess what's happening? We're getting a division going on here in America. 1992, we get the big divide over abortion starts to come up here. And look at this. Look at that image right there of the patriarch, priest, you know, and the woman here, she's condemning him. I mean, he's condemning her. And it's just, this has been a very emotional, charged issue here in America that has divided us religiously about abortion. But John Shelby Spong writes the book about Born of a Woman coming in 1992 about showing the myth of the virgin birth using the Bible, scripturally showing the myth of the virgin birth. Then we have here, now we're going to look at some other things. You want to see this reflection of how spirituality is broadening out in all realms here? Magazine covers tell an awful lot. Time magazine, 1992, God and Women, about the second Reformation that is sweeping Christianity. And here is the third Anglican bishop to be ordained, a woman in the pulpit. Radical concept. Marianne Williamson will come on the scene next, writing A Return to Love, her version of the Course in Miracles. So now she emerges here as another great spiritual voice. Then we have a movie called Dead Again that's going to come up following here, a fantastic movie on reincarnation. How many of y'all have seen Dead Again? It's absolutely, it's a thriller. It's so well done. And then Jackie Small, who I mentioned earlier, the founder one of the founders of transpersonal psychology, writes this book, Awakening in Time, The Journey from Codependence to Co-Creation, of really bridging the gap into the deepest spiritual realm of the soul, which is what Jackie's really about. Then we have Megatrends for Women coming out. Not just Megatrends, but this is Megatrends for Women. And it was because the chapter 7 in the original Megatrends book of 1982 was so important, the one from Megatrends from the 1990s, the 7th chapter was so important that we're capturing, or they're talking about just the Megatrends for Women alone. Now, then we get the Chicken Soup for the Soul series that comes out. Then you have the 5 Gospels coming out, which is showing about the greater biblical scholarship here from what the Jesus Seminar scholars did, were the 200 of the finest biblical scholars in the world got together. And as opposed to keeping scholarly work in academic circles, what they did was they took it directly to the public and released it for everyone's own information, so you could get what the Bible was really about, which were the authentic words of Jesus and which were not the authentic words of Jesus. 1994, we get another huge thing. This gets really big, is the gay rights movement gets very public, and we have this huge march in New York City, and it's the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Inn incident. And this is where, and this has been a dividing thing for a lot of religions, from the fundamentalists to the more progressive ones, about gay rights. But gay rights are human rights. And the irony of this thing is you will hear fundamentalists bash gays for being, as something that's not part of family values, and really the irony of it is, probably nobody is a greater advocate of family values than our gays. If you see gay couples, the most loving couples together, really are about family values, but they're about equal rights values. Then you have, in 1994, 1993, this great book coming out, The Celestine Prophecy, which shows a tremendous breakthrough. This was the #1 selling book in all of 1994 here in America, was The Celestine Prophecy. John Crossan writes the revolutionary biography of Jesus, one of the Jesus Seminar scholars. Newsweek, look at this one. Search for the Sacred, America's Quest for Spiritual Meaning, hitting the front covers of our magazines. Jackie Small writes another book called Embodying Spirit, coming alive with meaning and purpose. Then we have another great phenomenon, Conversations with God, hit the scene. Deeply powerful book about understanding the soul, understanding God from a personal level, and also and having direct connection to both the soul and God. We find out in 1995 that global warming is a fact. We're over 2,500 climatologists from 60 countries are declaring global warming as a fact. So we're having to think about nature differently, ecology. The environmental movement branches out and becomes much bigger with ecology. Then Carolyn Mace comes on the scene writing Anatomy of the Spirit. Fred Alan Wolf, great quantum physicist, writes the book The Spiritual Universe. So again, this whole idea of spirituality is broadening more and more. Apple uses this ad with Gandhi about think different. Maybe not seeing that real clear, but it says think different right there. Life magazine has this front cover of Astrology Rising. U.S. News and World Report has a front cover in 1997 about life after death. Newsweek follows it with about re-envisioning the meaning of Mary in the Christian tradition. Then you deal with the Oprah factor, the goddess of daytime TV. The lady who has brought so much spirituality out on mainstream TV that you didn't need to go to seminars too much after that, because you could get almost everything you needed by listening to her in the afternoons. The Inner Life of America's Most Powerful Woman. Here's the front cover of Life magazine. You'll notice what it says over on the left-hand side. What is the soul? Meditating from Deepak Chopra, Shirley MacLaine, Marianne Williamson, and Reverend George Foreman, and 35 others talk about that. This is a deeply spiritual movie dealing with the soul, the game, but you wouldn't know it until you sat all the way to the very end. And the very end pops you so big because it tells the story of the soul and how we sign up to play parts for each other. And we play the bad guy, we play the good guy, we play the in-between guy, all for our soul's evolution. Then you have Self magazine coming up here with, look at the front cover, Your Spiritual Life. My friend Colin Tipping writes the book in 1997, Radical Forgiveness. And then you also have in 1997, here's on TV Guide, God and Primetime TV. They're doing all this opening up, this expansion of the spiritual stream. Then here's Primetime Search for God. Then on Time Magazine, we have this front cover. This is wonderful. Does heaven exist? We're asking, does heaven exist? And you know what? We get that answered right here with Crown Royal. And it says, yes, heaven on earth is where heaven exists. Is this not getting so spiritual? Look at how this is broadening out. We're totally out of the closet here. Then when you get a movie that talk in 1998 about what dreams may come. And this is about showing that hell is a projection of your own thoughts. It's not a place, it's whatever you believed is what you recreate in the next life because you have a belief that you need to recreate that in the next life. Larry Dawsey writes The Reinvention of Medicine in 1998, and again, from a deeply spiritual perspective, and then Elizabeth Lesser from the Omega Institute writes this one, The New American Spirituality in 1999. Great movie, comes out in 1999. Tuesdays with Morrie, another deeply spiritual movie. Then Oriah Mountain Dreamer will write her book called The Invitation, another huge bestseller, all based on a poem that is going all over the internet. And here we are to 2000, and where are we from 2000 to now? The mainstream churches are still divided over AIDS victim, over women ministers, and gay ordination. The evangelicals and the religious right politicize religion because they think that America's going to hell in a handbasket. So, and by the year 2000, the Christian Coalition is the strongest political force in America and is credited for the election of George W. Bush. They're evangelical. And I wish I could talk about, I'll talk about that one another night. But so then we go into 2001. We're looking at this poll that comes from, that was on Now, Bill Moyer's Now. 76% of America say they're Christian. 13% say religious and non-secular. But let me say something. Many of the metaphysical religious churches, such as this one, would claim that they're Christian first. Science of Mind would claim they're Christian, and some would say non-secular. So this is just showing a breakdown here of where we are in 2001. But remember, spirituality is out in the open. It's just spreading everywhere, and it's unorganized. It's not going to show up in organized places because it's so individual. The Da Vinci Code is written, and this is waking more people up to discovering the different authentic teachings of Jesus. And here's a wonderful symbol from my buddy Vic Simon. Some of y'all know Vic. This is his own personal symbol, and I love it because I think it really incorporates what the new spirituality is about. You know, this is a symbol of the Tao, the rose and the lotus. The rose is the Western tradition that is outer focused. The lotus tradition of the East is inner focused. And if you will notice what he's showing here is within the rose, right here, you have the lotus. Within the lotus, you have the rose at the heart of it, showing the complementarity of the Eastern Western, of the male and female traditions there, that the light living within the darkness, but it's really how all of it comes together and feeds each other. Then we find this in Newsweek, and this is just out this recently, this last 2 weeks, what we believe generally here in America. 36% of the book of Revelation is true prophecy, 47% say it's metaphorical. Now that's a really important thing. 36% say it's literally true, 47% say it's metaphorical. That's showing this broadening of the spiritual tradition, the allegorical interpretation of the Bible that started with Father Origen. 55% think that that they will be taken up, that the faithful will be taken up into heaven with the rapture. 74% of this is interesting, of Americans believe that Satan exists. Among evangelicals, it's 93%. 17% believe that the end of the world will come in their lifetime. Just 17%. And some of them are trying to bring it about right that have the power to do that right now. Then we get this one, the new prophets of the Revelation. These are the authors from the Left Behind series. Okay? Tim LaHaye, who used to be the associate minister at Prestonwood Baptist Church here. Actually, Tim LaHaye, who is here on the left hand, on y'all's left-hand side, actually is the one that Jerry Falwell learned and was inspired to create the moral majority because of a political action group that Tim LaHaye had created in 1976 to get Ronald Reagan elected in California. Jerry Falwell saw that, and that was the model of his moral majority one that has later moved into becoming the Christian Coalition, which is the largest political force in America today. Here's something from this same Newsweek article, and I just want you to look at this for a minute, because this should bring up some emotion. Look at this. Please turn to Jesus. This is about this idea of the amendment to banning gay marriage. And we got this sign down here, homosexuals are possessed. The civil rights issue of the 21st century is human rights for homosexuals. That was the civil rights issue of the 20th century was for blacks and women. And now it's for homosexuals to honor their humanity, their individual right to be here with full laws, full protection of this government. That is a progressive message. It's a progressive message of spirituality. It's so natural, it's almost ridiculous to even contemplate this. And yet we do. Yet we get emotionally divided over this. Banning them from having marriage, so what? God would have you love everybody. What difference does it make? Why are we getting our panties in a wad over that? I don't know. But we have a lot of homophobia in this country, the same as we have racism and sexism in this country. That's my own personal editorial on it, and it's coming from a very deep heterosexual who believes in honoring homosexuality as a human choice. Let me say this about this real quickly. Big picture, from the level of the soul. If we want to put this in perspective of how ludicrous it is to argue this, and particularly the idea that homosexuals do this out of choice, I would contend that nobody in their right mind or their left mind would choose to be a homosexual in this deeply anti-homosexual, homophobic culture where you get persecuted and you get strung up on a fence post in Wyoming like Matthew Shepard. Nobody would want to be homosexual out of choice in this culture. It takes a very strong, brave, courageous soul to incarnate as a homosexual. It's a soul choice. It's a hard path. But I honor them for what they go through, and I feel the pain. And we all should feel the pain, because that is a very courageous soul choice before we come in to do that. So, as we look at some of the things the church gets us into, well, we get all nutted up and worried about a lot of things, but I think this Methodist church has the right idea. Don't let worries kill you, let the church help. And that's exactly what's going on. The church has been helping us all along. That's why there's been such a great dropout here of moving into spirituality. The churches are good. They serve a purpose. They're training wheels, like every other institution is a training wheel till we're ready to let go of the training wheels and discover God by ourselves directly and be able to ride that bike alone and not need to go through there. The church and the stream have operated side by side. I won't go into this right now, don't have time, but about the difference between spirituality and religion. But the idea is that spirituality is about finding God within, and religion is about seeing God on the outside and separate from us. Spirituality is that God indwells us, that we can have our own personal experience of God. And we don't need to go through the religious beliefs and dogmas and rituals to find God. Heaven or hell are right here, right now, not someplace we die off into. We are all souls in evolution. We're not humans born in sin. We're humans born in trial and error and experimentation and evolution. So, spirituality is about the love from God as opposed to what religion teaches about the fear of God. Anyway, let me move through this, because one of the things I want to say about the separation of church and state, the separation of church and state has protected religion in America, because it has allowed all kinds of religions to flourish and all kinds of beliefs to flourish. But what we've had here in America is the Native American spirituality undergirding and surrounding everything, while we've continued the America's religious road and America's spiritual stream. Sometimes they've been side by side. And let's see, there we go. Then they've been up and down with each other, with one feeding the other, as we talked about originally. But when it comes down to it, what we've really got is Native American spirituality, the American spiritual stream, and then the church coming from within that, the religious road. But maybe there's a better way to look at it, and maybe it is this, that there's the grand cosmos out there, and we're just one little small dot in the cosmos, and Native American spirituality, indigenous wisdom, is the closest to getting back to the mind and God directly that way. And then within that, we get America's religious stream coming up. And then from within that, who can't hold any one of those other higher thoughts, we have to develop religions to give us the training wheels to be able to discover God within ourselves. And this great spirituality is what America is about, is bringing forth this great spiritual message, because America has the spiritual energy which no other nation has here on the earth that contribute to the liberation of mankind. And we're moving into our real founding fathers right here, of honoring both sets of founding fathers that we have. This is a print by David C. Barron's. If anybody wants it, it's wonderful. This is the story of America's spiritual stream, and is why we are here as spiritual Green Berets, to bring about the transformation of America and of the planet by bringing forth our spirituality into everyday life, activating even our political life with our spiritual values. Because we always get the leaders we deserve. They are a reflection of us by right of consciousness. So, this is the story. This is the layer of America's spiritual stream, and next week we will deal with America's soul and the immigrant soul gifts, and then after that we will be dealing with juicy stuff with America's shadow, and we just got 4 more classes left. But anyway, any questions? Any comments? Did I leave anything out? Thank you all.